Hidden inside every bite of cheese is a forgotten medieval mystery. This simple food once shaped entire societies, fueling armies and filling monastery larders across Europe. By the end of our journey, you will understand how this humble craft influenced everything from economics to religion in the Middle Ages. We will uncover how monks turned milk into a durable treasure and what secret ingredients they used long before modern science. What is your favorite cheese, and have you ever wondered about its ancient origins? A world without refrigeration demanded animals that thrived in harsh conditions. Across the cool, damp fields of England and France, the cow was queen, producing the large volumes of milk needed for the hard, long-lasting cheeses that could feed a village or be traded at market. But journey to the sun-baked, rocky hills of the Mediterranean, and you would find a different dairy master. Goats and sheep, agile and resilient, were the true lifeblood of these regions. Their richer, fattier milk yielded smaller but intensely flavorful cheeses, a testament to the land itself. This was not a matter of preference, but of pure survival. Each region's cheese became a unique signature, shaped by the soil, the climate, and the animals that could endure there, yet who held the knowledge to transform this simple milk into a lasting food. The answer lies behind the high stone walls of monasteries and within the bustling economy of the manor estate. Monasteries became the unexpected innovation hubs of medieval cheese. With vast tracts of land and a disciplined, literate workforce of monks, they could perfect recipes over generations. Their records, carefully handwritten in ink on parchment, are some of our first detailed cheese-making manuals. They experimented with aging processes, different bacterial cultures, and pressing techniques, treating the craft with a near-scholarly devotion. It was here that many of the classic European cheeses we know today were essentially born. Meanwhile, on the feudal manor, cheese was economics. The lord's demesne, his personal farmland, was worked by his peasants. The milk from his cows and sheep was a valuable resource, and turning it into cheese prevented waste and created a stable, durable food source for the entire household, from the knights to the servants. For the peasant families, a small cheese made from their own single family, cow or a few goats, could mean the difference between sustenance and starvation through a long winter. Can you hear the quiet, daily bustle of these places? The rhythmic sloshing of milk in the dairy, the heavy scent of curds draining in woven baskets, the patient turning of wheels in cool, dark cellars. This was not just cooking, it was a crucial pillar of medieval life, happening from the grandest abbey to the most humble cottage. The daily rhythm of cheese-making began with the first light of dawn. A farmer or a dairymaid would settle onto a low stool, a wooden pail held securely between their knees. The milking was done entirely by hand, a slow and patient process that required a gentle yet firm touch. Freshness was not just a matter of quality, it was an absolute necessity. In a world without any form of mechanical cooling, milk would begin to sour within hours, especially during the warm summer months. This meant that the journey from animal to cheese vat was incredibly short. The warm, frothy milk was often used the very same day it was collected, sometimes within just an hour or two. You can almost feel the urgency in that morning air, the understanding that every moment counted. The milk was carefully poured from the pails into larger ceramic containers or wooden tubs. These vessels were chosen for a reason. Wood, while porous, could be scrubbed clean, and its insulating properties helped keep the milk at a stable temperature for a little longer. Ceramic pots, often glazed on the inside, were non-porous and easier to clean thoroughly, preventing unwanted bacteria from a previous batch from spoiling the new, precious milk. This initial handling was a race against an invisible clock, a daily practice that separated successful, edible cheese from a wasted, spoiled resource. But what happened once this fresh milk reached its destination? The true alchemy was just about to begin. The warm milk's journey was far from over. To transform it, medieval cheese makers relied on a mysterious key ingredient, a substance that seemed to perform pure magic. This was rennet, a natural enzyme found in the stomach lining of young calves. After a calf was slaughtered for its meat, Its fourth stomach, called the vel, would be carefully cleaned, salted, and dried. A small piece of this preserved stomach would then be soaked in warm water or fresh milk. The liquid that resulted was a powerful coagulant. When this rennet was stirred into a vat of warm milk, it performed its silent miracle, causing the liquid to separate into solid white curds and a pale, watery liquid known as whey. It was an alchemical process that must have seemed almost supernatural, turning a familiar drink into an entirely new substance right before their eyes. But what if you had no access to a young calf? Resourceful communities across Europe discovered that nature provided other solutions. Certain plants, like thistles, nettles, and fig tree sap, contained their own milky sap or enzymes that could also coagulate milk. These plant-based rennets created cheeses, often softer and more perishable, that were vital for peasant families or during religious fasting periods when animal products were restricted. The exact moment the curds formed was a critical point of judgment for the cheesemaker. Too little rennet, and the milk would remain a soupy liquid. Too much, and the cheese could become tough and bitter. This was a knowledge passed down through touch and sight, not by a written recipe. Can you picture the careful watch over that milk vat, waiting for the moment it thickened into a delicate, wobbling gel? That simple transformation was the true birth of every piece of cheese, a daily mystery solved with a piece of a calf's stomach or a handful of wild thistles. That delicate, wobbling gel of curds was a substance of immense potential, but also of incredible fragility. The cheesemaker's next task was a careful operation of separation. Using a tool that often resembled a harp, a long wooden frame strung with parallel wires, they would slowly slice through the pristine white mass. This was a moment of supreme focus. The size of the cut was everything. For a soft, moist cheese, the harp would cut the curds into large, uneven chunks, perhaps the size of walnuts. These bigger pieces retained more of the trapped whey, resulting in a final cheese that was supple and creamy. But for a hard, long-lasting cheese that could be aged for months or even years, the cutting was far more precise. The harp would sweep through the vat again and again, slicing the curds into tiny, uniform grains, no bigger than a grain of rice or a kernel of corn. This exhaustive cutting forced out as much whey as possible, leaving a drier, denser curd that was the foundation of a cheese built for the future. The skill in this action cannot be overstated. It was a physical understanding of cause and effect, a knowledge written in the hands, not in a book. The gentle sloshing of the whey as the curds were stirred, the feel of their resistance against the wooden paddle, all told the story of the cheese that was yet to be. This single decision, made in a quiet dairy room, determined whether a community would enjoy a fresh, spreading cheese within weeks or a hard, grating cheese that would nourish them through a lean winter. How many lifetimes of observation were encoded in that simple, harp-like knife? With the curds now cut and the whey beginning to drain, the most physically demanding part of the process was about to begin. That careful cutting of the curds was just the prelude to the great separation. As the harp did its work, the pale, cloudy whey began to visibly pool around the solid white curds. Draining this liquid away was the next critical step, and it was achieved with ingenious simplicity. The entire contents of the vat were poured into large, woven baskets or cloth bags, often made of coarse linen. These were hung from hooks or set on slanted boards, allowing gravity to pull the whey slowly and steadily through the porous fabric. For a harder cheese, the cheesemaker would take a more active role, gently pressing the bag or even placing a clean, heavy stone on top of the curd-filled cloth to force out every possible drop of moisture. This patient dripping could take hours, a slow transformation from a wet, lumpy mass into a coherent, solid form. The sound of those last few drops of whey hitting a collecting bucket beneath the hanging sack signaled a milestone. The cheese had taken its first true physical shape, but what of the vast quantity of whey left behind? In our modern world, we might see this as a simple byproduct to be discarded, but in the medieval economy, waste was an unthinkable luxury. This leftover liquid, rich in proteins, sugars, and minerals, was far too valuable to pour away. In the monastery or manor kitchen, whey became a versatile ingredient. It could be used as the liquid for baking bread, giving the loaf a subtle, tangy flavor and a softer crumb. It was the base for simple soups, often poured over grains and wild herbs to create a nourishing, if humble, meal for the working members of the household. But its most vital use was perhaps as a nutritious supplement for the animals. Pigs, in particular, thrived on a diet supplemented with whey, fattening up more quickly for slaughter. Even the chickens and dogs would eagerly lap it up. This created a beautiful, closed-loop system on the farm. The milk from the cows or goats was transformed into cheese for the people, and the leftover whey was returned to the animals, sustaining the very creatures that provided the milk in the first place. Nothing was wasted, and every resource was honored. Can you see the elegant cycle, the milk giving life again and again? With the whey drained and put to good use, the young cheese was ready for its final defining act, a process that would determine its character for months or even years to come. With the young cheese now formed, its final defense against decay was a simple mineral, salt. This was not merely a matter of adding flavor, it was an act of preservation, a critical step that determined whether the cheese would survive for weeks or for many months. The method of applying this salt varied, creating two distinct paths for the cheese's future. For many hard, long-aged cheeses, the technique was dry salting. The drained curds, still in their loose form before being pressed into a final wheel, were generously mixed with coarse salt by hand. This ensured the preservative was distributed throughout the entire mass of the cheese from its very core. For other types, particularly larger wheels, the method was brining. The newly pressed cheese was submerged entirely in a concentrated saltwater solution, a brine, for hours or even days. The salt would slowly penetrate the cheese from the outside in, creating a protective rind that was far less hospitable to the molds and bacteria that caused spoilage. In both cases, salt performed a silent, chemical miracle. It drew out even more residual moisture through osmosis, effectively dehydrating the cheese just enough to make it an unsuitable home for harmful microbes. At the same time, it encouraged the growth of desirable, harmless molds on the rind, which contributed complex flavors during the aging process. This humble mineral was the difference between a perishable food and a durable staple. Can you appreciate the profound knowledge this represents? Without understanding the science of microbiology, medieval cheesemakers used salt as their primary tool for food safety. They knew through observation and tradition that a well-salted cheese did not rot. It matured. It transformed. In an era where a failed harvest or a spoiled food supply could mean hunger, the ability to salt a cheese correctly was a skill that safeguarded a community's survival through the coldest, darkest months of the year. This newly salted mass of curds was still a fragile collection of individual pieces, a puzzle waiting to be locked into a single, solid form. To achieve this, the cheesemaker turned to one of the most iconic tools of the craft, the press. The simplest presses were nothing more than a weighted board placed directly on top of the curds, which had been packed into a circular wooden mold. A heavy stone, perhaps selected from a nearby riverbed for its smooth, flat surface, would provide the steady, gentle pressure needed to knit the curds together and expel the last traces of whey. But for the hard, dense cheeses destined for long aging, a far more sophisticated device was required, the screw press. This apparatus, often made of a sturdy wooden frame with a large, threaded wooden screw at its center, allowed the cheesemaker to apply immense and controlled pressure. By turning the screw, they could gradually increase the force, squeezing the young cheese with a power no simple stone could match. The amount of pressure applied was a critical decision. A soft, fresh cheese like a rustic farmer's cheese needed only light pressing, just enough to form a loose, moist cake. But a wheel meant to survive a sea voyage or feed a monastery through winter required tremendous force, pressed for hours or even days until it was as dense and dry as a stone. This was the moment the cheese truly earned its future. The press gave it its final identity, its texture, and most importantly, its structural integrity for the long, silent transformation of aging. Can you hear the quiet, rhythmic creak of the wooden screw as it was tightened? A sound that promised sustenance for the difficult months ahead. With its shape now permanently set, the cheese was ready for its long sleep in the cool, dark air of the aging cellar. That final press did more than just shape the cheese, it gave it a unique identity recognized across the countryside. The wooden molds themselves were far from uniform, carved into forms that became as distinctive as a family crest. In regions like the Swiss Alps, you would find enormous wheels, sometimes weighing as much as a full-grown man. This was not for show, it was pure practicality. A large, thick wheel had a smaller surface area relative to its volume, meaning it aged slowly and resisted mold, perfectly suited for long storage in a high-altitude cave. Contrast this with the small, delicate discs made by French Trappist monks. These smaller cheeses could be made quickly, aged faster, and sold or consumed within a single season, fitting the rhythm of a monastic community that valued both self-sufficiency and charity. The shape was a direct response to the environment and the needs of the people who made it. Some molds were even designed to imprint a signature pattern directly onto the cheese. A basket weave design pressed into the rind was not just decoration. It provided texture for beneficial molds to grip, and it identified the cheese as coming from a particular valley or abbey. In an age before packaging and labels, the cheese's very form was its passport, telling a story of its origin to anyone who knew how to look. Can you see a marketplace centuries ago, where a merchant could tell at a glance, just from the size and pattern of a wheel, whether it came from a windy Dutch plain or a sheltered Italian monastery? This was a silent language of craft and place, etched not in words, but in curd and rind. The shape of the cheese was only its temporary form, a promise of what was to come. Its true character would be forged in the silent, cool darkness of the aging room. Monasteries and manor houses often had deep cellars or even repurposed natural caves, spaces where the temperature remained consistently cool and the air was heavy with a particular moist humidity. This stable environment was not an accident, it was the essential crucible for maturation. Inside these dim chambers, the young cheeses were placed on wooden shelves, and here they began a slow, patient dance with time itself. A fresh cheese straight from the press was bland, rubbery, and moist, a blank canvas. The aging process, which could last from a few weeks to several years, was a controlled decomposition, a biological symphony orchestrated by the cheese maker. Beneficial molds and bacteria, either naturally present in the air of the cellar or deliberately introduced by smearing the rind, went to work. They broke down the fats and proteins within the cheese in an incredibly slow, methodical way. This breakdown is what created the complex flavors and textures we cherish, transforming that simple, bland curd into something sharp, nutty, earthy, or creamy. Without this quiet, dark sanctuary, cheese would remain a simple, perishable food, never achieving the depth that made it a legend. Can you almost smell that cellar air, thick with the scent of earth, wood, and slow fermentation? This was not a passive storage, it was an active vigil. The cheesemaker's work was far from over. Each cheese required regular attention, a careful rotation. They would be turned by hand, often every single day at first, then weekly as they aged. This turning ensured that the moisture within the wheel distributed evenly, preventing one side from becoming soggy and another from drying out and cracking. For cheeses developing a natural rind, this physical contact was also a moment of inspection and care. Many were brushed with a simple tool, perhaps a handful of coarse straw or a stiff bristled brush, to remove excess mold and encourage a strong, healthy rind to form. This rhythmic, patient maintenance was a form of conversation with the food, a daily ritual that could last for months or years. The cheesemaker was not just a producer, but a guardian, shepherding each wheel through its transformation. They learned to read the rind like a map, understanding by touch and smell when a cheese was progressing perfectly or if it needed a change in its environment. This intimate, daily relationship between the maker and the maturing cheese is a forgotten art, a testament to the patience required to build flavor one day at a time. What stories could those silent, aging wheels tell, if only we could listen? That silent vigil in the aging cellar was a form of devotion, a practice perfected within the high walls of medieval monasteries. Here, cheese-making transcended mere craft and became a scholarly pursuit. Monks possessed two priceless assets that no peasant farmer could match: vast tracts of pasture land for their dairy herds, and the profound ability to read and write. They treated cheese-making with the same meticulous care they applied to illuminating sacred manuscripts. Every step, from the temperature of the milk to the timing of the rennet addition, was carefully recorded on parchment. These were not just simple notes. They were the first true, systematic recipe books for cheese in Europe, preserving successful techniques and noting failures for future generations to avoid. This disciplined, recorded experimentation over decades and even centuries allowed them to refine their art to an astonishing degree. They understood that a cheese aged in a damp, stone cave near a river developed a different character than one aged in a dry mountain cellar. They became masters of their environment, using these subtle differences to create a stunning variety of cheeses, many of which are the direct ancestors of celebrated varieties we enjoy today. But this hard-won knowledge was not for public distribution. The specific recipes for their most prized cheeses, the precise blend of cultures, the exact brining times, these were secrets guarded as closely as the monastery's own relics. This was intellectual property in its most tangible form, a secret that could ensure the financial health and renowned reputation of an entire abbey for generations. Can you fathom the weight of that secret, passed in whispers from one master cheesemaker monk to his chosen successor? This protected knowledge was the cornerstone of a thriving economic engine that powered monastic life across the continent. That secret knowledge, perfected in monastery cellars, did not stay locked behind stone walls forever. It traveled, carried by monks and merchants along trade routes, and it blossomed into a stunning tapestry of regional varieties across Europe. Each cheese became a perfect echo of its homeland, a direct response to the landscape, the climate, and the people who lived there. High in the Alps, where winters were long and brutal, survival depended on durability. Here you would find colossal wheels of cheese, like the Swiss Emmental, aged for months in cool mountain caves. These cheeses were incredibly hard and dense, with a low moisture content that made them resistant to spoilage. Their famous holes were not just a quirk. They were the result of specific bacteria that produced carbon dioxide, creating pockets of air that made the cheese lighter to carry down from the high pastures. This was food designed for endurance, a concentrated source of fat and protein that could sustain a herder or a soldier for an entire season. Now, travel west to the rolling green hills of France. Here the climate was gentler, the winters less severe. This allowed for a completely different approach. French monks, particularly in regions like Normandy, perfected softer, creamier cheeses that aged for a much shorter time. A cheese like Camembert, small enough to fit in the palm of your hand, was a world apart from a giant Alpine wheel. Its soft, bloomy rind and oozing interior were a testament to a milder environment and a culture that prized immediate, complex flavors over multi-year preservation. The very size of the cheese spoke volumes. One was a fortress built for a siege. The other was a delicate treasure to be enjoyed within a single season. But what of the sun-drenched Mediterranean? In the rocky hills of Italy and Greece, resources were scarcer, and the heat posed a different challenge. Here, cheesemakers turned to the resilient sheep and goat, and they used every tool at their disposal to preserve their smaller yields. This led to the creation of uniquely spiced and brined cheeses. In Italy, peppercorns or chili flakes were often mixed directly into the curds of a pecorino, the spices not only adding flavor but also acting as natural preservatives that fought off harmful bacteria. Further east in Greece, the solution was brine. Submerging a cheese like feta in a salty solution preserved it perfectly in the warm climate, creating a tangy, crumbly cheese that could last for months without refrigeration. Can you see the brilliant logic in this delicious diversity? From the hardy, practical wheels of the mountains to the delicate, quick-ripening discs of the plains and the boldly preserved cheeses of the south, every variety was a perfect, delicious adaptation. The map of Europe could be drawn not just by its borders, but by the distinct character of its cheeses. The rhythm of the medieval dairy was set by the turning of the earth itself. Cheesemaking was not a year-round endeavor of uniform product, but a deeply seasonal dance with nature's cycles. The quality and even the type of cheese produced shifted dramatically from spring to winter. In the lush green days of spring, just after the animals had given birth, the milk was at its richest. This was the time for prized, fatty cheeses, often softer and more perishable, bursting with the flavors of new grass and wildflowers. As summer progressed and the pastures matured, the milk changed, becoming slightly less rich but more abundant, perfect for the large, hard wheels destined for long aging. But when autumn arrived and the animals were fed on hay and stored grains, the milk thickened again, taking on a different, deeper character. A cheese made in October was fundamentally different from one made in June, a direct reflection of the animal's diet and the land's bounty. This seasonal variation meant that a medieval person did not eat the same cheese all year, but experienced a changing palette of flavors, from the bright and fresh to the hearty and profound. Can you taste that journey through the year in a single slice? Beyond the immediate season, the broader climate of a region wrote its signature directly onto every wheel. In the cool, damp air of an English cellar, molds grew slowly, creating earthy, mellow flavors over many months. But in the hot, dry climate of a southern Italian hillside, cheesemakers had to adapt quickly. Their cheeses were often smaller, salted more heavily, or even smoked over fires to create a protective rind that could withstand the heat. The very air a cheese breathed as it aged, whether it was the moist sea breeze of a coastal cave or the thin, crisp air of a mountain monastery, imparted a unique microbial fingerprint, a terroir that could never be perfectly replicated. The cheese was not just made from milk and rennet, it was made from time, season, and place, a true product of its moment in the world. This humble wheel of cheese was a form of concentrated power on the medieval table. For the vast majority of people, the peasants, meat was a rare luxury, perhaps enjoyed only on a few feast days each year. Cheese, however, was a daily and vital source of protein and fat, a nutritional cornerstone that provided the energy for backbreaking labor in the fields. A chunk of hard, aged cheese with a piece of coarse bread was a complete meal that could sustain a family through a long day. But its importance did not end at the peasant's cottage. Up in the manor hall, cheese was equally present, though in a different form. It appeared on the noble's table as a final course, a digestive aid after a heavy meal, or was cooked into sophisticated dishes like pies and tarts. It was a food that transcended social class, uniting the entire medieval world in a shared, essential sustenance. Yet cheese held a special, almost paradoxical role during the many religious fasting periods that dotted the calendar. On days when the church forbade the consumption of meat, cheese became the primary protein. It was the saving grace of Lent, a time when monasteries would consume their own stores and distribute cheese to the poor, turning a dietary restriction into an act of charity. This elevated cheese from a simple food to a spiritual resource, a gift that sustained both body and soul. Can you sense the quiet relief a family must have felt, knowing their stored wheels of cheese would see them through a lean and pious season? Beyond the local village and the abbey walls, cheese evolved into a valuable engine of trade. A well-made wheel was durable, portable, and only improved with age, making it an ideal commodity. Merchants would transport wheels by the cartload along bumpy Roman roads and across rivers, their value increasing with every mile from their origin. Famous cheeses from specific monasteries or regions gained legendary status, their names becoming synonymous with quality. A wheel of cheese could be used to pay rents and taxes to a local lord, a tangible representation of a farmer's yearly labor. In bustling market towns, it was a bartering tool, exchanged for cloth, tools, or pottery. Some of the hardest, longest-lasting varieties even traveled across continents, carried by pilgrims and soldiers as a reliable ration that would not spoil. This simple food fueled not just bodies, but the very economy of an era, weaving a network of taste and trade that stretched from the highest Alps to the busiest coastal ports. The story of medieval cheese is not just one of craft, but of survival, faith, and commerce, all bound together in a single, enduring form. Each tool in the dairy was an extension of the cheesemaker's own hands, a carefully crafted object designed to guide milk through its miraculous transformation. The heart of the operation was the cauldron, a massive vessel often made of copper. This was not a random choice. Copper heated evenly and quickly, allowing the cheesemaker to bring the milk to the exact right temperature without dangerous hot spots that could scorch the precious liquid. Imagine the gleam of that wide, shallow pot over a low fire, its surface reflecting the flickering flames as the milk warmed. After the alchemy of rennet did its work, another specialized tool took center stage, the cheese harp. This was not an instrument for music, but for precision. Its frame, strung with fine wires, was drawn through the vat of set curd, slicing the delicate gel into perfect uniform pieces. The harpist in this case was not creating a melody, but determining the very texture of the future cheese, with every sweep of the wires deciding its final destiny as either moist and soft or dry and hard. Once cut, the curds and whey were poured into waiting molds. These were not simple containers, but shaped wooden forms, often circular, that gave the cheese its distinctive size and profile. The inside of the mold might be lined with a coarse cloth, a cheesecloth, which allowed the whey to drain while holding the soft curds together. The young cheese, now in its mold, was then placed on a mat woven from river reeds or straw. This humble mat was a masterpiece of simple engineering. It lifted the cheese slightly off the shelf, allowing air to circulate underneath, which prevented damp rot and encouraged an even rind to form on all sides. Finally, for cheeses that required it, came the press. From a simple wooden board weighted with a heavy, smooth river stone to an elaborate wooden screw press that could exert immense and controlled pressure. This tool finalized the cheese's form, knitting the individual curds into a single, solid wheel and squeezing out the last reluctant drops of whey. Can you see the quiet, purposeful activity in that dairy room? A symphony of simple tools, each performing its essential part in an ancient, delicious ritual. Every tool and surface in the dairy held a hidden threat. Without any knowledge of microscopic bacteria, the medieval cheesemaker waged a constant, invisible war against spoilage. Their greatest weapons were not chemicals, but the elements themselves. Fire and water were the first line of defense. All wooden tools, from the stirring paddles to the cheese molds, were regularly scrubbed and then scalded with boiling water. This ritual of cleansing was as much a part of the daily routine as milking the cows. The intense heat killed off unseen invaders, a practical solution born from observation, not scientific understanding. They knew that a vat washed with cold water produced cheese that spoiled quickly, while one treated with boiling water yielded a clean, lasting product. The materials they chose were also a deliberate defense. Smooth, non-porous surfaces were prized. Ceramic pots could be scrubbed to a clean finish, and over time, the use of copper for cauldrons was discovered to have a natural property that discouraged the growth of certain molds and bacteria. Even the practice of salting the cheese so heavily was, at its core, a powerful method of preservation, creating an environment where harmful life simply could not thrive. Can you sense the profound intuition at work here? They were fighting an enemy they could not see, using methods they did not fully comprehend, yet their traditions formed a formidable barrier against decay. This daily and meticulous hygiene was the unspoken secret that separated a successful, nourishing cheese from a dangerous, wasted one. This invisible war against spoilage led to one of the most creative chapters in medieval cheese making. Beyond salt and smoke, the dairy offered a natural palette of colors and flavors, a garden of preservation and taste. Herbs, spices, and even edible flowers were not merely decorative. They were powerful tools in the cheesemaker's arsenal, used to enhance flavor, mask imperfections, and further protect the cheese from decay. Imagine a peasant woman walking the edge of a forest, her basket filling not with mushrooms, but with pungent wild garlic, peppery watercress, and the sharp, clean needles of rosemary. These were not random choices. Many of these plants possessed natural antibacterial properties. When chopped and kneaded into the curds, they release their essential oils, creating a hostile environment for harmful microbes while simultaneously infusing the entire wheel with their distinct character. This was practical magic, turning a functional food into a fragrant masterpiece. The variety was as boundless as the European countryside itself. In the verdant hills of England, you might find a crumbly white cheese studded with vibrant blue borage flowers or the purple petals of chives, a delicate treat meant for a spring feast. Travel to the sun-drenched south of France, and the cheeses would be robust with the ricinous bite of thyme, marjoram, and wild fennel, herbs that thrived in the dry, rocky soil and whose strong flavors could stand up to aging. In Italy, the story was one of boldness. Whole black peppercorns or fiery, dried chili flakes were mixed into the curds of a hard pecorino. The spices did more than just add heat. They created tiny pockets of preservation throughout the cheese, their sharp oils acting as a natural defense system. This was the original locavore movement, centuries before the term existed. A cheese was a direct reflection of a 1-mile radius around the farm. If the local meadow was abundant with chamomile, the cheese might carry its gentle, apple-like note. If the forest provided juniper berries, the cheese would take on a crisp, piney depth. The recipe was written not in a book, but in the landscape itself. Every bite told you exactly where you were, a delicious map of local botany and tradition. Can you taste the history in that? The next time you enjoy a cheese with herbs, you are not just tasting flavor. You are tasting a medieval solution, a clever use of the land's bounty to create something both beautiful and enduring. This ancient practice of infusion would become the foundation for some of the world's most beloved cheeses. A legacy of flavor born from necessity and a deep, intimate knowledge of the natural world. That slow transformation in the cellar was a biological symphony conducted by invisible life. Medieval cheesemakers were masterful conductors of this orchestra, yet they had no idea the musicians even existed. They observed the effects with a sharp eye, noticing that a cheese stored in one corner of the cave developed a blue-green veins, while another grew a fuzzy white coat, and a third became glossy and orange. They learned to encourage some of these changes and scrub away others, all without understanding they were managing a complex ecosystem of molds, yeasts, and bacteria. These tiny organisms were the true artists of flavor, working in a silent, microscopic feast upon the wheel. The hard, bland curd straight from the press was a banquet table for these microbes. They produced enzymes that acted like millions of tiny scissors, slowly snipping apart the long, complex chains of proteins and fats. This breakdown, this controlled decomposition, is the very heart of ripening. It transforms the tough, rubbery proteins into softer, more soluble fragments, which is why an aged cheddar becomes crumbly and a soft brie turns liquid. Simultaneously, the fats are broken down into fatty acids, which create the sharp, tangy, and sometimes peppery notes we associate with complex cheeses. The medieval maker knew that a cheese needed to breathe, to be turned, and to live in a specific atmosphere. They were managing the airflow and humidity that these invisible workers needed to thrive, creating the perfect conditions for a delicious decay. Can you grasp the profound mystery they faced? They witnessed a solid food becoming runny, a bland substance developing profound depth, a white wheel blooming with colorful molds, all guided by forces they could not see. It must have seemed like magic, or perhaps divine intervention. The specific microbes present wrote the final flavor profile. A Penicillium roqueforti mold, introduced by leaving a loaf of rye bread to mold in the cave and then rubbing that mold into the curds, would create the dramatic blue veins and pungent, sharp flavor of a blue cheese. A white, bloomy rind of Penicillium camemberti resulted in the soft, edible crust and creamy interior of a brie. And a regular washing of the rind with brine or ale encouraged bacteria called Brevibacterium to grow, giving washed rind cheeses their distinctive pungent aroma and robust, meaty flavor. They were cultivating these communities by touch, sight, and smell, their hands transferring the very cultures that would define their cheese for generations. This was science practiced as an art, a deep, intuitive partnership with an unseen world that turned simple curds into one of humanity's most enduring and beloved foods. The cheese wheel's journey did not end at the dinner table. It became a powerful symbol, its image woven into the very fabric of medieval life, from the pages of illuminated manuscripts to the stories told by the fireside. In the vibrant tapestries and painted panels of the era, a plump, round cheese resting on a table was not merely a still life object. It was a direct signal of domestic harmony and earthly abundance. A household that could display a whole cheese was a household that was prepared, prudent, and prosperous. This simple food represented the successful management of land and livestock, a testament to a family's ability to not just live, but to thrive. Yet in the playful verses of popular poetry and fables, cheese often took on a humbler, more humorous role. It was the food of the honest peasant, a symbol of unpretentious contentment and simple, hard-earned sustenance. Can you see the duality? In one context, cheese signified wealth and careful planning, and in another, it celebrated the virtues of a modest life. This symbolic power extended into the spiritual realm. Monasteries, the great centers of cheese production, also incorporated it into their acts of charity. Distributing cheese to the poor during religious festivals was not just about feeding the hungry, it was a potent gesture. The gift of this durable, nourishing food symbolized divine providence and the monastery's role as a steward of God's bounty, sharing the fruits of the land with the entire community. Even in secular ceremonies, cheese held a place of honor. In some regions, a fine wheel of cheese was considered a prestigious gift, offered to a visiting lord or bishop as a mark of respect and a demonstration of the local community's skill and self-sufficiency. Its presence in a marriage dowry or as a settlement in a local dispute underscored its tangible value, a form of edible currency that carried the weight of tradition. The cheese was more than a food. It was a silent character in the story of the Middle Ages, speaking volumes about prosperity, piety, and the simple, good life. A sturdy cheese wheel was a traveler, built to endure the jolting cart rides along ancient Roman roads and the swaying decks of river barges. These durable wheels became a vital commodity in a growing network of medieval trade. From a remote Alpine monastery, a cart loaded with massive rock-hard cheeses would begin its slow descent into the valleys. The journey was treacherous, but the payoff was immense. In the lowland towns, these cheeses were not just food. They were a taste of a distant, almost mythical landscape, and people were willing to pay a premium for them. This demand gave rise to specialized cheese markets in bustling towns. Imagine the scene in a place like Gouda in the Netherlands. The main square would be packed on market day, the air thick with the earthy scent of countless cheeses. Farmers and monastic agents would stand behind their wares, their wheels arranged by size and quality. Buyers, often guild representatives from distant cities, would move through the crowd, tapping wheels, sniffing rinds, and negotiating prices. This was not a casual exchange. It was a serious commercial event where fortunes could be made on the quality of a single season's production. In such a crowded marketplace, how could a buyer know which wheel came from the famous abbey known for its perfect aging, and which was a lesser imitation from a nearby farm? The answer lies in the birth of early branding. Cheesemakers began to mark their products with a signature of origin and quality. They used carved wooden stamps to press a distinctive design directly into the rind of the young cheese. This could be a symbol, like a cross for a monastic cheese, a family crest for a manor, or the town's own coat of arms. Some even used a special brand to mark the cheese itself, burning a symbol onto the wheel with a hot iron. These marks were a promise. They told a buyer that this cheese was made by a certain producer, according to their respected methods, and that it was authentic. A wheel bearing the mark of a renowned abbey could command a much higher price and travel much farther than an anonymous one. It was a primitive but powerful form of consumer protection and marketing, creating the first cheese celebrities whose reputations stretched across regions. Can you see the trust embedded in that simple stamp? It transformed a local food into a traded good, carrying the name and the pride of its maker to every corner of the known world. Cheese was not merely food in the medieval mind, it was a potent form of medicine. When a person fell ill, a physician might well have prescribed a specific cheese before any herbal concoction. This practice was rooted in the ancient system of humoral theory, which believed health was a balance of 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Every food, including cheese, was classified by its essential qualities, whether it was hot or cold, moist or dry. A fresh, moist cheese was considered cool and damp, and thus suitable for a patient suffering from a hot, dry fever, as it would help restore the body's balance. Conversely, a hard, aged, salty cheese was seen as hot and dry, making it a recommended food for those with a cold, phlegmatic disposition, believed to generate warmth and vitality from within. This was not casual dietary advice, it was a formalized medical doctrine, detailed in the handwritten texts that guided a doctor's every decision. Can you picture the learned physician, parchment unrolled, carefully matching a patient's symptoms to the exact type of cheese that would correct their humoral imbalance? The application extended to specific ailments. Soft, fresh cheeses were often used in poultices, applied directly to wounds or inflamed joints to cool and soothe the skin. For a persistent cough, a remedy might involve mixing grated hard cheese with honey and herbs to create a soothing electuary. Even the whey, the leftover liquid from cheese making, was prized as a medicinal drink, prescribed as a cleansing tonic or a cure for digestive troubles. This belief in the healing power of cheese reveals a world where the kitchen and the apothecary were one and the same, and a simple wheel on the shelf was as much a part of the family's medical cabinet as it was their pantry. The cheese on your plate was a perfect mirror of your place in the medieval world. For the common folk, the peasant families working the land, cheese was a straightforward sustenance. Theirs was often a fresh, unaged cheese, made quickly from whatever milk was available that day. It was soft, moist, and meant to be eaten within weeks. This was a practical necessity, as most peasant households lacked the deep, cool cellars required for long aging. Their cheese was a food of immediacy, a daily portion of protein and fat to be crumbled over pottage or eaten with coarse bread in the fields. It was simple, tangy, and vital, a humble reflection of a life lived close to the soil and the seasons. Contrast this with the cheese that graced the noble's table. In the great hall of a castle or manor, cheese was an experience. The lord and his guests enjoyed wheels that had been aged for months or even years, developing complex, sharp flavors and a firm, grating texture. These were the cheeses produced in the specialized dairies of monasteries or on the lord's own demesne lands, where resources and knowledge allowed for such patient refinement. The very act of aging was a luxury, a form of delayed gratification that common people could rarely afford. A long-aged cheese represented wealth, not just in its superior flavor, but in the sheer capital it embodied, a food that was stored and improved instead of being immediately consumed. The noble's cheese was also more likely to be infused with expensive, imported spices like pepper or saffron, or sealed in wax for presentation, turning a simple food into a statement of status and sophistication. Can you taste the divide? One cheese was a tool for survival, the other a symbol of privilege. Even the way it was eaten told a story. A peasant consumed their cheese as a core part of a meager meal, while a noble might enjoy it as a final course, a digestive aid after a feast of roasted meats, a subtle luxury to cap an extravagant display of power. This social hierarchy was baked into the very rind, a silent but unmistakable language of class and consumption that everyone understood. These handwritten manuscripts are our only direct window into the medieval dairy. Tucked between prayers for a good harvest and remedies for sick livestock, you can find instructions for turning milk into cheese. The challenge is deciphering a language of craft, not science. A recipe does not call for a specific temperature. It instructs the maker to heat the milk until it is as warm as a mother's bath for her newborn child. The amount of rennet is not measured in grams, but described as a piece the size of a hazelnut or the tip of your thumb. This was a knowledge of the body, passed from hand to skilled hand. To read these texts is to eavesdrop on a master teaching an apprentice, speaking in a code of sensory experience that we have largely forgotten. How do you translate the feel of curds that are ready to be cut, or the exact smell of a cheese that is aging perfectly? These manuscripts capture that intimate, physical wisdom, yet within their poetic phrasing lies a startlingly sophisticated understanding of process. A 13th century English text details the repeated washing and pressing of curds to create a hard cheese, a method that aligns perfectly with modern principles of moisture control for long-term preservation. Another from a French monastery describes salting a cheese in stages, a technique we now know encourages a stronger, more protective rind to form. They may not have known the words for lactose or casein, but they mastered the behavior of milk through decades of meticulous observation and recorded trial and error. These pages are not simple lists. They are the lab notes of early food scientists, documenting a craft that was both an art and a precise, repeatable discipline. The survival of these recipes reveals a world where the making of a simple cheese was considered knowledge worthy of parchment and ink, a secret powerful enough to be written down and protected for future generations. That ancient knowledge, locked away in monastery manuscripts and passed down through generations, never truly vanished. It merely waited in the cool, dark quiet of history, ready for a new age to rediscover its wisdom. Today, a growing movement of artisanal cheesemakers is looking backward to move forward, deliberately reviving medieval techniques to create cheeses with a profound sense of place and time. They are not simply copying old recipes, they are rekindling a philosophy, one that values the slow transformation of raw materials over industrial efficiency. You can taste this revival in the resurgence of raw milk cheeses, made from milk that has not been pasteurized. Just as in the Middle Ages, these cheeses retain the full, complex microbiome of the farm, allowing flavors to develop that are impossible to replicate in a standardized product. Modern affiners, the masters of aging, now seek out specific caves and cellars, understanding that the ambient molds and bacteria in a particular environment are not contaminants, but essential collaborators. They age their wheels on traditional reed mats, just as their medieval predecessors did. Knowing this allows the cheese to breathe and develop a more complex rind. This is a conscious rejection of the sterile, plastic-wrapped world, a return to the belief that cheese is a living, breathing expression of the land. What does this ancient craft teach us in our modern world? It reminds us that the deepest flavors cannot be rushed, that true craftsmanship is a conversation with nature, not a command. It shows us the value of closed-loop systems, where nothing is wasted, from the whey fed back to pigs to the rind that protects the precious interior. The next time you unwrap a carefully crafted artisanal cheese, you are not just holding a food, you are holding a piece of living history, a direct link to the monastic scribes and the dairy maids whose patient hands perfected this alchemy centuries ago. Their legacy is a quiet invitation to slow down, to savor, and to remember that some of the most enduring treasures are born from patience and a deep respect for the natural world. The path from a medieval milk pail to your modern cheese board is a story of human ingenuity. For centuries, this craft was not a hobby but a pillar of survival, a quiet revolution in how we preserve and honor the gifts of the land. Every technique, from the choice of a wooden mold to the patient turning of a wheel in a cellar, was a hard-won answer to the challenges of a world without our modern comforts. Cheese shaped economies, fueled journeys, and even defined the rhythms of faith, proving that the most profound histories are often written in curds and whey. So the next time you enjoy a piece of cheese, take a moment to consider its long journey. Perhaps you will seek out a local variety made with traditional methods, or simply share a story of your own favorite dairy discovery in the comments below. What forgotten flavors are waiting on your own doorstep, ready to connect you to this ancient, delicious legacy?